Great, welcome everyone. Thanks for coming to our book launch of a new monograph about the work of Fred Tomaselli. We're very pleased to have Fred here with us. My name's Ian Barry from the Tang Museum at Skidmore College. And
I'm Heidi Zuckerman Jacobson. I'm the director and chief curator at the Aspen Art Museum.
And I'm Fred Tomaselli.
And Heidi and I organized a survey of Fred's work, which had its run at the Aspen Art Museum this summer and fall, and we have some images on the screen of that show, which will be coming to the Tang this February, and then the Brooklyn Museum after. And we have some images, and we pulled out a few works that are sort of important works that are included in the show, and also got us talking about the work and about our project in many different ways. We're going to talk a little bit about the slides, and there'll be plenty of time for you to ask questions of Fred. And then afterwards, we have some books here that Fred will sign.
So maybe I can just orient everyone with this installation view. One of the things that was different about this exhibition of Fred's work, we called it a selective survey. We're not calling it a mid-career survey or anything like that, or even a retrospective. But the idea was to organize the works in the exhibition according to art historical genres. And the way that Fred has traditionally presented his work is the same way that he's created his work, which is moving back and forth between genres. So in Fred's own words, which we'll hear from him in just a moment, he would create, for example, a figurative work, which would be very labor-intensive, and then he would, quote-unquote, give himself a break and make an abstract work. And so previously the works were installed in this chronological fashion, so moving from one to the other based on when they were made. And so this exhibition separated the works into 3 or 4 areas: figuration, landscape, abstraction, and kind of had a bird wall also. But this is the upper gallery, and that's where we showed the abstract works. So the works were installed based on their formal qualities and the relationship to each other rather than when they were made, and it allowed the viewer to see a progression in Fred's work, but also to see how his practice had evolved quite substantially over this period of time.
One of the important works that we had a piece of in the exhibition is a series called Chemical Celestial Portraits. And it's an early work of Fred's, and I thought it would be a good way for you to start and talk about the way you invented a new way of making a portrait.
I guess this series began in 1991, and what it was is questionnaire-based portraiture, where I asked the sitters for their birth date, which would then correspond to an astrological house of the zodiac, a sign, and then it would then correspond to an astronomical location in the heavens. What I would then do is take pills and sugar and put them on photographic paper and expose them to light, making a photogram of the constellation of, say, if someone was born under the sign of Sagittarius, it would be Sagittarian. And then in that same questionnaire, I would ask the sitter to list every drug they could remember taking. And then I would then relabel the stars of that sitter's portrait. So it became a portrait of inner space and outer space, a sort of chemical celestial portrait of the sitter. In this case here, what I did was I took, there were 12, I just ended up finding 12 of my friends under the 12 houses of the zodiac, and then arrayed them on the wall, sort of chopping up the heavens. And you know, I don't necessarily believe in astrology. I don't disbelieve it. I just don't really have any relationship to it. But I felt it was an interesting way of sort of organizing information about people to kind of discuss sort of a little person in a kind of and pulling them into like the grand cosmic. So it was sort of like tiny and vast at the same time, and inner and outer.
I would say that that's one of the organizing components of your work in general, or qualifying that, but to say that your work is interested in organizing things. It's very much about these various taxonomies, which are of personal interest to you, and from nature to gardening to astronomy or astrology, even that, though that might be tangential.
Yeah, I'm very Victorian in that regard. I mean, I basically, a lot of the, in my early work, it was primarily objects that I would array, you know, on these monochromatic backgrounds. But when I started inserting photographic imagery, the initial imagery was coming out of field guides that I was using basically because I'm a birder. Wow, it's Beethoven. Check it out. But anyway, initially these sort of field guides that were laying around my house that were sort of informing these hobbies of mine started sort of ending up in my work, and it sort of seems like that's been the trajectory of my work. Like all these side interests that I have that aren't necessarily about art end up becoming part of my practice. So you know, the longer I live and the more interests I have, the more there's a sort of palimpsest of information gets heaped into the objects.
It's an excellent segue to this piece, which is called Superplant, which is a little squashed on that slide. It's actually a little taller than that. And Superplant was the first work that you saw when you came in the Aspen Art Museum on the first floor. And it, for us, when we were looking at the work in the galleries, it sort of became this great introduction because it was this one new species created by Fred in the studio that had everything you need in it. What was in this plant?
Well, I'd like to say initially, when I made this piece, it really seemed like very transgressive to me personally because it was so, at the time for me, decorative to the point where it seemed almost frivolous, and I was scared of it. And so I hid it away for a while, but eventually I came around to it. It's become a very important piece to me. It really is a hybrid in that I should probably get up here and show it to you. Is there a detail of it? Probably not, right? Oh, hey, check it out. It's basically, the reason I call it Superplant, it's 6 different psychoactive plant materials hybridized into one plant species. So there's like coffee beans, hemp leaves, ephedra stems, which contain the active ingredient for methamphetamine, tobacco leaves, morning glory scenes, which contain an indole related to LSD, and magic mushrooms. So there's 6 different psychoactive plant materials in this work. So the reason I call it Superplant is if it ever really did live, it would rule the world. But it was also informed simultaneously by my love of Rajasthani miniatures, and the way that the flora is depicted in that sort of Mughal style Indian miniature paintings, and then also simultaneous with that. It was also informed by folk art, specifically the Shaker Tree of Life that you'll see. So there's a lot of my influences of outsider art, Asian art, and conceptual art are sort of commingling in this work. And then the blue flowers were just, I put them there because it needed blue flowers to make it pop. So
I know people are always wondering where the things come from that make it into your work. And I know there are certain things that are discussed and are not, but the thing that I wanted to get to you to talk about was the elements of your work that you actually grow yourselves, and like the fig tree leaves, for example. So.
Yeah. I do grow. I'm an avid gardener, which is another another sort of endeavor that I put into my work. And I pick the leaves and put them in plant presses, and then eventually, and sort of create sort of these sort of taxonomical organizational systems. Those, by the way, are in combination with like pills organization systems and a whole photo archive of where everything is sort of like broken down into genus, species, size, color, etc. And you know, some of the work here, like the, you know, I grew the pot, but I don't anymore because I have this neighbor, and then but you know, like the ephedra stems, I gathered and when I was hiking in Utah. It's known as Mormon tea, which is just funny because you know, they're not allowed to drink caffeine because of it being a stimulant, but they found this little workaround with ephedra. So all the Mormons drink that instead, and it'll get you really buzzed. And then coffee beans, and then, you know, the tobacco leaves I got from some Cuban cigar makers in Lower East Side, and the morning glory seeds I grew myself, and I don't know where the mushrooms came from.
But the reason I wanted you to talk about that is because I'm really fascinated by your own system of classifications. And so when you were talking about the genus and the species and the whatnot, it's almost like a modern day version of some both cabinet of curiosity, but also a new scientific system.
Yeah, I mean, like, you know, science is, you know, gosh, if I was more, if I was more disciplined, I think maybe I might have become a scientist. It's certainly, I minored in, you know, earth studies. I was very interested in physics, and a lot of the sort of like half-assed knowledge that I have sort of like goes into my work. But, you know, I have so many interests that the discipline that I need to really see things through sort of crumbles. And the only place where it really comes together is where I become an artist. I think that's where I can take my sort of half-baked relationships to science and to nature and to technology and sort of put them in my work.
But that's the poetic magic, right? That's where everything's supposed to come together, is in your art.
I guess.
What else do we have?
This is a view of the downstairs gallery at the Aspen Art Museum, and it's a wall that kind of merges what we've been talking about this sort of natural science and investigation and sort of homegrown, homemade taxonomies with a more sort of critical look at the world and the sort of utopian and dystopian nature of our reality. And the one painting that we have in the show is called Desert Bloom, which is a painting that where Fred weaved together a variety of architectures that are related to utopian communities from different time zones, different lands, different places, different communities from very different ideas, but all with a somewhat ambitious utopian ideal. And they're all together in this web of potential trouble. They're in a new landscape, and what you can't see is that there's these great details of map topography, collage elements that are mixed in with these different architectures. And I'm wondering, Fred, if you can talk about what attracts you to sort of utopian thinking and those kinds of manifestos and communities, and what brought them together in this painting?
Well, you know, I have been, you know, inserting the social into my work since the very beginning. I'm not sure that you know, that I'm a political artist with a capital P, but I try to kind of like insert the social where I see that it dovetails with some of the concerns about art, like the kind of concerns that a painting can handle. And you know, as a, I don't know, for lack of a better word, a non-modernist or a postmodernist, as a person who's inherited the modernist legacy, I've inherited this whole history of utopian movements that have been supplanted by yet more utopian movements. I've also been historically been influenced, you know, by the collapse of the kind of the 60s into the sort of the punk rock world that I grew up in, and the sort of crisis of faith that resulted simultaneous with the crisis of faith that resulted around the collapse of modernism and postmodernism. And so this idea of like these kind of utopian superstructures all sort of working against one another, I felt like it was something that not only that I was personally affected by, but it also affects art history, a legacy which I had inherited. It also is very, it's at the heart of the American experiment. I mean, basically, Europeans came to America to create a new Jerusalem, to create, the new Eden, and thereby imposing ideology onto nature. And thereby, in the pursuit of imposing ideology onto nature, instead of creating heaven, created different forms of hell in the guise of slavery and genocide. And so what I decided to do was to look at this sort of the imposition of ideology onto landscape. So in the work is various architectural styles that sort of represent different political and spiritualist ideologies. So there's, for instance, there's some Mormon pluralist houses, the Unabomber cabin, Thoreau's cabin, Shaker meeting houses, the Aryan Nations compound. The Back to Land movement is represented by a few hippie communes. There's the Mel Lyman cult, the Charlie Manson Barker Ranch hideout. And if these people really did live together in a little town, obviously that wouldn't be a good place to live or a happy place to live. But I sort of feel like I've inherited all these sort of like, radicalist ideologies. And they've all sort of like ended up sort of fighting it out in my work. And I sort of feel like that's the way it is with me and ideology in general. I do like taking sometimes oppositional art styles, and like I was talking earlier about, the merging of, say, conceptual art with Asian art, with folk art. I like to throw as many of these different ideologies to battle it out in my work and see what happens.
I'm really glad that you're talking about some of these issues, and I think that it's fine to talk about being political in your work with a lowercase p, and maybe you're social in your work with a capital S. But I think that was, for me, a personal goal of this exhibition, was to be able to highlight the strong intellectual basis and social, political implications that you are foregrounding in your work, which perhaps maybe were secondary in some people's minds because of some of the other choices that were made in terms of materials or whatnot. So I really welcome the opportunity to encourage more people to hear you talk about these issues, because that's what I'm the most keenly interested in your work.
Well, I mean, it's an interesting thing. I really grew up in, I came of age and was really influenced by 70s conceptualism. Primarily I went to see Bruce Nauman retrospective when I was in high school, and it blew my mind. I was very influenced around this sort of conceptual movement of Southern California art, and I think maybe there's been an issue because of the craft, the labor and craft intensity of my work. I think sometimes, maybe people, maybe there's this sort of formalist sort of seduction in the work that sort of stops people from going there. But that's another kind of friction that I like, this notion between like the labored over object and the conceptual sort of commingling. And I think sometimes I tend to think of like the form of the work as maybe being akin to like the melody of a pop song, and that it sort of seduces a person into the space of the pictures, but then there's this text behind it, like the text of a pop song. And if you are seduced into the world of my work, maybe you can think about what it means later. But I do foreground the formal, but there is always this conceptual underpinning behind it.
Absolutely, and I think that attraction, repulsion, is very keen in your work, and I think that illustrates itself very visually as well. One of the things we really noticed in the exhibition is that people would lean in to see the work, and then they would lean back, and then they would put their glasses on and lean in, and then they would lift their glasses up, and then they would lean back. So it became this very kind of choreographed interaction with the work, and you could tell that people were really trying to visually mine what was there, as well as intellectually process what they were seeing. And I think
Details
that's
coming in and out of focus, and ideas coming in and out of focus. This idea that you started us out with this inner and outer selves, And that happens in so many ways in looking at the work. We have a few more minutes, and we would like to invite you to ask questions of Fred. So there's a microphone in the back. If you'd like to ask a question, now would be a great time. If you raise your hand, she'll bring a mic to you, and we can hear you.
It's like the Jerry Springer show.
Yeah.
There are questions here on the
Like
left.
stand up? There's a question over here.
Don't throw a chair
I'm
at me.
I was wondering, is this show traveling to Skidmore?
Right.
Or-
It'll be at the Tang next, and then the Brooklyn Museum after us.
Oh,
It
excellent.
opens in February at the Tang Museum at Skidmore College.
And then October at the Brooklyn Museum.
What's your sign? What's your sign?
I'm a triple Gemini, according to somebody who told me once.
Okay, then I have a follow-up question. Then you mentioned your interest in Rajasthani painting folk art.
I'm sorry?
You mentioned your interest in your botanical rendering of the plant with all the drugs and such.
Super plant. Yeah.
Super plant. So, and you mentioned the influences on you of folk art, and I think you said Rajasthani art and several other things. And then I wondered, what was the influence of drugs? Or was it theoretical?
It kind of started out theoretical, but you know, I think I've been really influenced by things that influenced what they call drug art. And although you know, I do tend to believe, not to get too wacky or anything, but I'm going to get wacky. I do tend to believe that I have been exposed to literally, you know, parallel realities, and I do believe that they actually exist, and that I've been given a glimpse to that. I've been given a glimpse to that. I've also, I also think that, like, you know, Kant talked about this sort of this sublime that I think is really hard for my generation to access. You know, this notion of the terrible sublime or the beautiful sublime, and I know a lot of people of my generation have been involved with debunking that notion of the sublime. But I can tell you honestly that I have actually experienced the sublime, but it was only chemically induced. And that chemical sublime has, I believe, influenced the way I see the world inexorably. My work is a hybrid of materials. It's a hybrid of pictures, of paint, and of real objects, and it's sometimes hard to tell the difference. It's a hybrid of ideologies, but I also think that, as I was saying before, but I also think that I myself am a hybrid. Not just in the normal ways that we talk about hybridity in terms of the media, but I also feel like I've been hybridized by my experiences with mostly, you know, with psychedelic drugs, and I put that into my work as well. So that's my influence.
Does evolution interest you in any critical way?
You know, you know, kind of, I do think that, like, I tend to, like, have a lot of, you know, as our DNA has all these other animals and life forms down in it, you know, and as you move up the evolutionary chain, you know, the DNA becomes more dense. And, you know, we're only like 98% of, you know, chimps are only like 98% of us, right? So we're just a little tip up. And I think that there's a sort of evolutionary, sort of Darwinian sort of world, you know, in my work, but there's also these like lower life forms that sort of, like, sometimes, like, there'll be a man, say, made out of bits of, you know, mammals and insects and reptiles and plants, and it sort of feels like sometimes there's this sort of Darwinian struggle in the tissue of the people that I'm making. And then there's also sometimes this sort of, I don't know if we have any of this work here depicted. There are some Darwinian struggles going on in these works here. This one here in particular, should we talk about that? Sure. This work here, for instance, is a work that I was living upstate New York, and I was having real problems with the bugs that were flying around at night, landing and sticking in my resin. So what I did is I aimed these halogen lights at my piece, put it out in a meadow, and all the bugs that were hatching in the river were attracted to the lights and formed this big cloud of bugs. And when it reached a critical mass, I poured resin out, and they stuck and dined in random formations, a kind of a collision between nature and technology, if you will. And I sort of saw it as a portrait of the atmosphere of that particular moment. And then what I ended up doing, it was a yellow background, and what I ended up doing was painting out a black background around all the various bugs, and then forming a sort of a landscape around it. And within the sort of inverted narrative of this work, instead of them dying in this work, they're actually hatching out of this sort of cadaver figure that's lying in the grass. There's these little cavities, and he's like the host of all these bugs, and they're like feeding off of him and flying out of his body. So that's kind of Darwinian-ish. And I like Richard Dawkins.
Any last questions? Well, thank you all for coming. We'd love for you to come up and see our new book and buy a copy. Fred will sign some books, and we hope you get to see the show on its tour. Thanks so much.
Thank you.